George Owers, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thank you for being very flexible with your calendar as we found a slot ahead of your upcoming book, The Rage of Party, which I think I would describe as the origin story for the formation of party politics in England. And I would say probably the history book that really describes what we saw within the political sphere on this island we call home. What motivated you to write a 500-page book on the topic? Why did you find it so important?
Well, I mean, partly because I think it's a great story, I'm not going to lie. It's got great characters. It all builds up to a fantastic crescendo and then becomes sort of part soap opera, part Greek tragedy towards the end. But on a more substantive level, I think it touches on what you just said, which is that in many ways it's the period where many of the cultural divides and political antagonisms that still are here to this day originate from. And it's also where many of the key institutions and changes that made, if you like, the modern world came into being. So, for example, this is the period, between. So we're basically talking about the period between the late reign of Charles II in the 1670s, 80s, through to when the Hanoverians become the royal family in 1714. So that's the Georges, basically the Georgians, if you like. And in that period, we see the Bank of England being founded, the national debt coming into existence, Parliament becoming a permanent institution that always sits, which was not very much not the case before. We see the union between England and Scotland becoming a reality. We see the rise of the City of London. We see all sorts of things, that without which other later developments, such as the rise of the British Empire in the rest of the 18th century, the current tensions over, say, the Union with, the SNP and the question of Scottish independence, all of these things originate in this era, and they are in many ways the product of the party divide between Whigs and Tories, and the fierce partisan battles they fought decided a lot of these things that have resonated for hundreds of years since.
Okay, George, so before we do a bit of a then and now and get into what we see resonating from that period to today, let's get into the origin story of the Whigs and the Tories. How did they come into being? What were the battles like? What were the culture war battles of the time?
So basically, to simplify crudely, there are sort of two phases of Whig versus Tory in the period I'm talking about. So at first, the easiest way to describe it is that the Whigs and Tories were essentially the extension into a later period of the older divide between Cavalier and Parliamentarian, or Cavalier and Roundhead, from the Civil War. So the Tories were the party, to put it crudely, of church and king, or queen. And they had high view of the authority of the Church of England, and they were often described as the church party. And they also initially had a high view of the authority of the monarch, because they believed the monarch was divinely ordained, and they basically sort of more or less believed in the divine right of kings and hereditary succession, and the monarchs were appointed and anointed by God. Whereas the Whigs were much less romantic and had a much lower view of the authority of the monarchy. They believed that the monarchs were more a contrivance of political convenience. Some of the more radical ones essentially believed in social contract theory, i.e. if a monarch did not uphold the lives and properties and so on of their subjects, they could be deposed. And then on the religious side, the Tories were, as I said, the church party, but specifically they were the party of what we call the High Church faction of the Church of England, which is essentially people who emphasise more the continuity with the pre-Reformation church. So they believed that the church was a sort of sacred body that could convey grace through the sacraments, and that the priesthood had a sort of much higher role, whereas the Whigs were the party of the lower church element and the dissenters. So the dissenters were essentially the Protestants who were more radical outside the Church of England. And they had a much lower view of the church, or indeed were outside the church altogether. So they believed they had a much more individualistic view of religion, essentially, that the important thing was hearing the word of God and having sermons and having an individual relationship with God and the church and priests and so on were not very important. So the Whigs, so there's a religious divide and there's a political divide, and that's how it comes into being, or the actual division between Whig and Tory first comes into being during something called the Exclusion Crisis, which happens. It starts in sort of 1678 and goes on until 1681, and this is towards the tail end of Charles II's reign, the Merry Monarch. And essentially, the question is who will succeed Charles II as king. The heir should be, or the current heir at the time was James, Duke of York, who was Charles II's brother. But there was a big problem in the view of a lot of people, which was that James, Duke of York, was a Roman Catholic. He had converted not entirely sure when, but at some point before he had in the 1670s, probably he had converted to the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in Protestant England, and indeed Scotland, this was not popular. The assumption of most Protestant Englishmen was that the Roman Catholic Church was a sinister, authoritarian, foreign force, which obviously comes from a cultural heritage of Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I's struggles against Catholic Spain, and so forth. However, and neither Whigs nor Tories were that keen on Roman Catholicism. However, the Tories' view was, well, James, Duke of York is the anointed heir to the throne, and it's to call that into question would be to court anarchy and chaos, and that he's been divinely ordained as to be the next king, and therefore we should support him becoming king. We hope that they hoped that he would respect the Church of England, but ultimately that was their view. Whereas what became the Whigs, were in favour of excluding James, Duke of York, from the succession on the account that they couldn't countenance under any circumstances a Roman Catholic king. And this becomes the whole thing is set off by what is called the Popish plot, which is a mad conspiracy put forward by a half-mad and extremely disreputable Protestant fanatic in 1678-9, and called Titus Oates. And this lights the touch paper of the controversy. And there's a big political battle, which you can read all about in the book, which I won't go into any great detail, but basically there's a huge political battle between the king, supported by a group of people who are increasingly referred to as the Tories, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Whigs, who are led by several people, but most prominently someone called the Earl of Shaftesbury, who wants to exclude James from the throne. And at first it seems that the Whigs might win because they dominate Parliament, but gradually the tide turns. Charles II outfoxes the Whigs with the support of his Tory allies, and the Whigs lose the first bout of the battle, essentially. Some of them were executed for an actual revolutionary plot to kill the king, which did actually exist, so it wasn't completely... But some of them were executed. The ones that weren't executed largely fled into exile, largely in the Dutch Republic. Some of them just kept their heads down in England. So that was the first bout. And then in 1685, Charles II dies and James II becomes king. And with reasonably little opposition, it's generally, at first, pretty smooth. However, James II soon runs into big difficulties because although he isn't quite the authoritarian butcher that a lot of the Protestants and the Whigs thought he was, he certainly was quite keen to use his position as king to promote the Roman Catholic religion. So he allows the Mass to be said in England. He allows Roman Catholic proselytization. He appoints Roman Catholics both to senior positions in the army and in the government. And all of this goes down like a cup of cold sick with not only the Whigs, the ones that are left, but also increasingly the Tories start to become rather unimpressed by this because the Tories are the church party and they see this as undermining the privilege and power of the Church of England. And so, but for a while, it looks like James II is, still in a reasonably strong position. But the thing that really does for him is two things. First of all, he has a son, which he hadn't previously had, and this raises the prospect of a permanent Roman Catholic monarchy because he's got a legitimate heir, a son, and it's almost certain that he'll be brought up as a Roman Catholic. The other thing that does for him is the external factor, which is that there is somebody waiting in the wings to exploit the unhappiness of many of the people of England and Scotland with James II and his Romanising, and that is a man called William of Orange, who is the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. Now, William has a claim to the English throne and the Scottish throne. It's not a brilliant one, but he does have a claim because he is Charles I's grandson. However, he is actually third in line to the throne. However, William is very keen to become King of England and Scotland, largely because he has been involved for a long time in a huge rivalry and indeed an on and off war with France. Now, at the time, France is the chief Roman Catholic superpower and easily the most powerful country in Europe, with a huge army under Louis XIV. And William has had to fight a long rearguard action to fight him off, and obviously Dutch Republic is sort of the centre of one of the most radical wings of Protestantism. It's a Calvinist country against Catholic France. William of Orange has largely fended the French off surprisingly well, but he's constantly fearing, and particularly in the context of 1688, which is when the Glorious Revolution, which is what we're talking about, happens. He fears that the French are going to invade. And what does he want? Well, he thinks, I've got a sort of claim to the English throne-ish. And England is a very wealthy country. If I gain control of the English and Scottish throne, I can use the taxes, the resources, the armies, and so on of those kingdoms to help me in my fight against Louis XIV. And so these two things converge. There's in England, there's a lot of unhappiness and protests and disorder against James because of his Roman Catholic policies. And at the same time, William sees the opportunity to come at first he says that he's coming to sort of help the English have a free parliament. But it is always probable that what he really wants is to claim the throne, which he does. The Protestant wind, as it's called, blows, which allows his ships to sail. He lands just near Torbay and in the West Country, and James's regime collapses pretty quickly. There is a little bit of fighting, not a great deal. And to cut a long story short, although the Tories are not that they accept this because they hate the Romanising, the Catholic policy of James, but they're very torn because they are the Church and King party, and what's happened is that the Church and King have become opposed, which is their worst nightmare essentially. So the Tories, when push comes to shove, they think, you know what, we're prepared to accept the William becoming king. We don't like it, but we'll accept it because it's better than the alternative, which is a Roman Catholic king and the church being undermined. So William becomes king. The Tories sit on their hands, accept it. The Whigs are jubilant because they've got rid of the Roman Catholic king that they'd always opposed. And a new phase, and this is the sort of second phase of the party battle, sets in. And this is change, and the dynamic changes in some important sense. The thing that never changes is that the religious element. The Whigs are always the party of Protestant descent and the lower church, more Protestant, if you like, element. And the Tories remain the party of the Church of England and particularly the High Church. That never changes, and that ebbs and flows over the course of the reign of William III. William of Orange has become a king, and then after him, Queen Anne. However, the other part of the political battle changes a lot because William III has become king. He isn't the anointed monarch. His claim is not that good to the throne. Divine right obviously doesn't apply to him. So the Tories increasingly become very sceptical about the monarch, and they become increasingly the party opposed to war and in favour of lower taxes, which had previously been the Whig sort of view. When the king was a high Anglican or a Roman Catholic Tory or supporter of divine right and so on, they were the party who were opposed to the court. They were against wars and standing armies and taxes. But in the 1690s, which is the key era, this all changes. Essentially, the Whigs, who were, if you like, to use slightly anachronistic terminology, had been the populist anti-government party. Actually, they become the opposite because of the new government under William III is one they approve of. They want a Protestant monarch. They want to fight the war against France because there is another factor, which is that some people still want to restore James II to the throne. They still foresee him as the anointed monarch. They're called the Jacobites. Now, they largely flee into exile. There's a war going on in Ireland in which the Jacobites led by James II, fight against William III. But the Whigs' view is, look, we have to defeat the French because they're the Roman Catholic absolutist enemy. We have to defeat the Jacobites. We have to support William III in his wars. What does wars require? Taxes. They require debt. They require us to roll our hands up and be pragmatic. So the Whigs, who'd always been opposed to that when it was Charles II and James II, become the oligarchic party of authority and indeed, in a weird twist, the monarchy. Whereas the Tories survey the scene and think, well, I'm not really sure that I'm that bothered about a war to defend the Dutch Republic. What is it to us? And they weren't very keen on having a foreign Dutch king, and they don't have any veneration towards a king that is not he's not the anointed successor. He's not the divinely appointed successor to the rightful king. So they think, as the 1690s go on, they become what we call the country party, which is the sort of the party of the country, against the court, against taxes, against debt, against standing armies. Whereas the Whigs become the opposite, and that's the big change. And so by the time that William dies in 1702. The scene has been set. You essentially have a increasingly, if you like, to some degree, populist Tory party. There's a sort of realignment. You have an increasingly populist Tory party who stand for low taxes, peace, and the church, against a Whig party who is increasingly sort of anti-populist, if you like, who stand for war against France, higher taxes, and in favour of religious minorities, i.e., the dissenters and their Protestant allies. So that is how it stands as you go into the reign of Queen Anne, and that's when it really gets even more intense. And you have that's the period of Queen Anne's reign from 1702 to 1714 is the era where the party battle reaches its most vociferous and heated pitch, if you like, which ends when Queen Anne dies and the Hanoverians come in. But I think I've spoken a lot, so maybe you want to rein me in a bit.
No, yeah, well, I'm certainly not rein you in, but pick at a few of the threads there. So I think people could recognise the Whig victory, which maybe you'll get into in a bit. And what I mean by that is, when you look at our political battles today, you could probably look beyond this point, but Brexit seems to be a bit of a pushback against being ruled by money men. It was also a bit of a bloody nose of the establishment, which has told us and enjoined us all to embrace toleration and pluralism. And I think you could also say the mainstream culture of our leadership class, elite class, whatever you want to call it, typically embrace dissent as bizarrely, they're part of the establishment, but there's a disestablishment element to them. But really, they're just pounding the rubble of whatever it is that they're railing against. It's long gone. And I suppose what I'm trying to get at is what we're seeing overlaid from that period to today, because I think we're seeing reverberations of the same story of effectively a nub of British people becoming increasingly flabbergasted that the system is arrayed against their interests. We see people who don't particularly want to be ruled by foreign interests, whether through the European Union or indeed whether it's through, you'll see people criticising various mayors and what have you. Forever wars, what has that got to do with us? Why are we borrowing so much money when we can't afford it? This seems to me like what we're seeing today is almost a replaying of that time, which is, right, could we just focus on our own interests and focus on our own independent island nation and stop being embroiled in all of these things and your own you being the moneyed men's interests endeavors, wherever it is that is taking you. What would you say? That's my take on it. What would you say is the overlap that from that period to today, and where is it that they start to diverge? Where's the battle been lost, I suppose?
Yes, I think that we are entering, and we have been in now, a period of politics in the contemporary world, which actually increasingly looks more and more like the Tory and Whig battles of this earlier period, and it's partly because the old cultural divides that originate really in the Civil War, but then mutate in the Tory the first era of party politics. They don't go away. Like, cultural divides are sticky, and although they're now largely couched in much more secular terms, because you have to bear in mind this is a religious era, the one I'm writing about. It's not religion; it's not the only issue, but it's a pretty important part of it. Now we obviously live in a more secularized age, but nonetheless, a lot of the cultural divides that were created by that era still endure. And basically the Tories had a form of sort of, it depends. Some people would say a sort of insular attitude, and others would say, a reasonable a focus on the national interest. So they would say, like, why are we getting involved in this war in Europe? I mean, to defend the Dutch against the French. I mean, what is it to us? Why do we care? Why are we being ruled by the Dutch king in the first place? And why should we be involved in the affairs of Europe? Whereas the Whigs' view was very much, if you like, our place is at the heart of Europe, because if we don't take an interest in Europe, then Louis XIV will dominate the whole continent, and then we'll find ourselves, isolate. They basically argued that an isolationist policy would come back to bite you in the end, because Louis XIV would become so powerful and he would threaten Britain's interests in the long run. And so, yes, there was clearly, like, Tory, sort of insular chauvinism, if you like, or to put it as in another way, a focus on the national interest without getting too much involved in foreign entanglements and forever wars. Which you should bear in mind that in this period that this book is set in, England and the Dutch are at war almost continuously for years. So there's the 9 Years' War in the 1690s, and then there's a brief period of peace between 1697 and 1702, and then there's another war, the more famous war, the War of the Spanish Succession, which is probably most famous for the Duke of Marlborough, who was a distant ancestor of Winston Churchill, who became a great military hero and won great victories against the French. So there's those two wars, and there's between 1689 and 1712, England is a war for almost that whole period, apart from a brief period in the middle of 5 years where there is peace. And it's not unsurprisingly, a lot of the people of England were extremely weary of the war, particularly by about 1710, when the war starts to become seriously politically contested. And so there's obvious to see. And I think what we're seeing in modern day politics is that if you look at the period, say, from the end of the Second World War through to quite recently, what was the main dividing factor in politics? Well, it was left versus right? It was Labour versus Tory. It was trade unions, public services, redistribution, material left-right things that, But my take would be that since, say, the 90s, but more pronouncedly since the last 20 years, those material left-right distinctions have faded, and what has come to the fore are questions of basically how should the country interact with the global economic order. So globalization, essentially, has become the key thing. And the response and that attitude of whether you believe in the nation state and the ability of the nation state to dictate its own affairs, or whether you are a more cosmopolitan supporter of global trade, global free movement, so on, that has become much. And although it maps onto the left-right divide now, but quite unclearly, because clearly. It's not as straightforward as it used to be. A lot of the forces in the modern world that are seen as populist right are actually not economically quite interventionist. They're not free market Thatcherites in the way that the right would have been 30, 40 years ago. So international issues are a large element of the structuring principle of modern politics. So it's much less the case that we see things in terms of, old-fashioned Labour versus Tory, sort of left v right, social democracy versus sort of conservatism. That's not the issue. And that's because of, I think, mainly globalisation, foreign wars, the long legacy of Iraq and so forth, and those sorts of things. and the reason why, and I think that's the reason why the politics of now increasingly resembles the politics of the period my book is about, because the realignment that took place in the 1690s happened for several reasons, but part of the reason, probably the main reason it happened, was because international affairs and your position on Europe and your position on global forces became much more important to politics. Like, whether or not we fought a war and in Europe, and whether or not we showed, if you like, solidarity with Protestants across Europe or not, became like hugely more important. Large, basically, because William III became king and took us into a European war. So it's a classic realignment because of new issue, and in the new issue, although it's somewhat different, obviously, it's not, but it's similar in the sense that international affairs and our attitude to the rest of the world and so on has suddenly become like much more important. And it has obviously these things, although they're in a way they're like about foreign affairs or our attitude towards the global order or whatever, they have domestic and economic implications. Obviously globalization has had massive economic implications in Britain and indeed America and so forth, just as fighting a war for 20 odd years had huge economic implications in the England of the 1690s, 70, and then up till 1714, because you've got to bear in mind that the period where these wars begin in the 1689 and go on, England hadn't really been involved. Britain, England, Scotland hadn't really been involved in a major land war for a long time, but we kept out largely. I mean, we date not entirely, but we hadn't. Last major land war we'd fought in Europe was basically in 100 Years' War, hundreds of years before. So it was a bit of a shock to the system that suddenly we were having to help either pay mercenaries or put our own armies into the field in a massive land war, and it cost a huge. To give you an idea, under James II, average annual expenditure of the English state was £1.7 million a year. That was the entire expenditure of the British government or the English government. Under William III, the average expenditure was between £5 and £6 million a year. So it triples basically the amount of money spent by the state. Triples. And this was a huge. I mean, although now it seems a bit quaint because now the levels of taxation and debt that are routine are like vastly higher, and we've come, and that's quite normal to us. But to the men of the mid 1690s, suddenly tripling government expenditure and with the correspondingly large increases in taxes was a massive shock to the system, and the people, and that changed everything. The foreign affairs becoming, indirectly or directly changing the entire basis of the British state and economic and financial policy, completely overturned British politics. And I think we've seen something quite similar. And then it maps onto cultural anxieties, whether justify. I have my own views, but I'm trying to see this fairly neutrally. The economic, these map onto the economic realities. If you're in the Midwest in America or the North, bits of the North in Britain where you've seen deindustrialization and the old jobs gone, replaced by warehouse jobs or whatever, then which is partly because trade patterns, the rise of China, free trade, and so on. Not surprisingly, you are going to be unimpressed, and you might then see that in the cultural side and the economic side are really hard to distinguish. People think that a culture war is separate from the economic and other side. It's not. And it was the same in the 1690s. A lot of the people who were extremely discontented with the new order that came in with William III, they had similar. There was a similar connection. So to put it bluntly, one of the key things that happened is that taxes went up, but taxation in those days was almost solely on the landed gentry, because that was the land tax was the main and most efficient method of taxation. So to increase the spending on the war, it hit the landed gentry. Now, the landed gentry, particularly the lower landed gentry, the poorer bits of the landed gentry, relatively speaking, they were the Tories. I mean, that was the basis of their social, the sort of social basis of the Tory party. I mean, not all the gentry were Tories, but most of them were. And so and then what happened? Well, the taxes still didn't cover government expenditure, so debt had to come in, and the national debt became a much more systematic, organised, larger scale thing because the Bank of England is founded in 1694, and it basically completely overturns and makes and gradually it makes the national debt a more, I mean, it's rational in a way because the national debt before was a mess, and it sort of consolidates it, brings down interest rates, brings order into the state's borrowing, and then massively increases the state's borrowing. But the interest has to be paid on the national debt. You know, what we would call bondholders, but at the time we usually called fund holders, money men, stock jobbers. I mean, there were various terms for them. But they were paid interest. So the landed gentry thought, well, hang on a minute, we're paying all these extra taxes, and who is benefiting? Well, the people who've lent money to the government are, a reasonable rate of interest. They're making money out of this, and they're not taxed. The financial interest wasn't the people who lent money to the government weren't taxed. It was not in those days. And so funnily, and the other crucial thing about the financiers or the money men who became prominent in the 1690s is that they are very disproportionately, they were Protestant dissenters, which is not surprising because Protestant dissenters have been excluded from large parts of public life. So it's not uncommon that a minority that's been excluded goes into things like finance and banking. And so they did. So something like 40% of the governors, of the people who ran the Bank of England were dissenters, which when you consider that the dissenters as a proportion of the population were far lower than that. So the Tories thought, not only are the people who are taxing us, bleeding us dry with taxes, they're not only these sort of upstart nouveau riche financiers, but they're also large, not all, but disproportionately dissenters who they hated anyway for religious reasons. So the cultural side, which was dissent versus the Church of England to a large extent, mapped onto the economic side, that the economic interests and the cultural divisions were not separable. And I think, in many ways, something similar is the case today. Like a lot of the people who've lost out from globalization, are they clearly, the cultural side, that they feel that their country has been, the character of their country has been changed by multiculturalism, immigration, and so on. They also are the people who've economically lost out from globalization in many cases. You go to parts of what is, the Red Wall or Barking and Dagenham or so on. Those people have not done economically well out of the last 30 or 40 years, generally speaking. And they're also the people who, are more, a good way of putting this is like it's the somewheres and anywheres of David Goodhart.
Yeah, I was thinking about Goodhart when you were talking.
And good. So that and I think the original anywheres, somewheres and anywheres, or in the Goodhart classification, were mapped quite well onto Tory versus Whig in the first stage of politics. And today, the similar thing, they people think, it's just people are clinging on. I mean, it's often presented as people are clinging on to patriotism and flag waving and stuff because they're backward or sort of bigoted or whatever. But to some extent, it's because they think that they've lost out from an economic order that has come into being over the last sort of 30, 40 years, in which globalization has meant many of the jobs and stuff that they used to rely on have been exported to China or wherever. So, culture wars and economic interests are not separate. They're rarely separate. Usually the culture wars have an economic side to them. And the other thing I would say is that, yes, Whig versus Tory was a culture war. But then again, it seems to me most political divides that become very heated are basically culture wars. People dislike it. I mean, the sort of hating the other side because of perceived cultural deficiencies, or that they see basically one side sees the other side and as degenerates in some way who are against all that's good and true in the world and so on, and the other side see it as have much the same view of the other side as well. That's so common in all politics, like not in British politics. I mean, you see it again in the 19th century with wars between in the late Victorian period, sort of Salisbury era, where you have sort of loyal monarchist imperialist Tories who see the Liberals as selling out Ireland and the Empire, and it's not new, and it never goes away. I think in some ways what is interesting is that the period in, say, the 30 or 40 years after the Second World War in this country is unusual in that those sort of cultural divides actually were relatively low key. They were actually not that important. Like, if you look at the politics of the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s in this country, and indeed the 1940s in Britain, culture wars were much less pronounced. They were unusually downplayed because the divide was like the trade unions and workers, not all of them, but a lot of them voted Labour for class reasons, and the middle classes and the small businessmen and so on voted Tory for similar class reasons. But culturally, both sides were not that massively different. Like, they were, I mean, most Labour voters in the 40s and 50s and 60s were actually quite socially, small c, socially conservative, as were the Tory voters, who were small business owners and stuff. The difference was, we want higher taxes on this, or we want union laws to be stronger or weaker or whatever. But that was unusual, I would say, in the grand sweep of British politics. Like most of it, and not just of British politics. I mean, America has been having these sort of culture wars forever. But, that period after the war was an unusual interlude where people, and I think what we're seeing now is the return of politics as usual to a large extent, like, culture wars mapping onto economic divisions of economic interest and divides which are, if not religious, then close to religious. Because, I think, take a lot of the rows now over trans rights or whatever, which I'd rather not get into the details of, but I think, in a way, it seems to me that they're sort of displaced religious arguments, over the nature of the soul, or whatever. And so even the religious side of it doesn't, it's not, no longer are these sort of arguments, if you like, they're not in terms of the authority of the Church of England, or, the role of the sacraments, or justification before God, or whatever. They're rather, is there such a thing as a gendered soul, sort of thing. But they're still, in a sense, religious, and though that's always been the case, because humans are beings which seek meaning, they're spiritual sustenance, and an identity, and a sense of identity. Because identity is massively important in the period I'm writing this book about. The Tories see themselves as the heirs to the loyal, good old English principles of loyalty to the crown, and the old England of the parson and squire having benevolent authority over the people and so on. And whereas the Whigs, saw themselves as their identity was really important to them. They were the defenders of religious, some of them saw themselves as the defenders of the good old cause of the Civil War, the more radical ones, the defenders of Parliament and liberty, and Algernon Sidney, who was a Whig martyr who was executed in the early 1680s, went to the scaffold saying, I die, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something that he said something like, I die on the scaffold, for the sake of the good old English principles of Protestantism and liberty. So both sides thought that they were fighting in a way for, the soul of the country and what it really stood for and so on. It's just once they have very different visions of what they thought that was. And you see that now, like, obviously nobody in the current culture war, whether they're the most they're Guardian reading progressives or whether they're reform voting flag wave, Union Jack wavers, neither side sees themselves, they both obviously think that they're the real patriots and they're the really moral. There's a huge moral aspect to it. They see the other side as wicked and bad, and that they're, and undermining the integrity of, the morals of the country or whatever. And that's exactly, and then the more that people think that, the more that they, are quite key that violence becomes an option. And we shouldn't forget that this period is a period where violence still lurks under the surface. The period of my book, a civil war is avoided largely because the Jacobites, who would be the obvious sort of people who would cause a war, are so useless and can get nowhere essentially because they're very disorganised and so on. But election campaigns in this, in the reigns of William III and Queen Anne are not tame affairs. There's a lot of riots, people being battered senseless by medieval weapons, and punch ups, and people standing in the polling. The place where people, because in these days people you had to go in and there was no secret ballot, so you went in and you declared who you were voting for in front of the returning officer, and this which gave great scope for intimidation. So you'd have Tory mobs or Whig mobs, depending, would take over the polling place, the town hall or whatever. And if anybody went up and said, "Oh, yes, I want to cast a vote for whoever was the Whig candidate," then the Tories would sort of be standing there with a pike in hand, ready to batter them senseless if they voted the wrong way. Listen, violence was there, but and violence, as we see sadly, is not so far under the surface in modern day politics with its sort of Manichean culture wars.
Well, let's talk about modern day politics, linking back to what you just said there. We're talking about battles for identity, and we are currently recording at a time where there has been a preponderance of St. George's flags and Union Jacks being planted around the country in towns and cities. And this is in an era where we have spoken predominantly for 30 years since Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, about British values, tolerance, fair play, respect. And these pronouncements on what British values are have typically come from the Whiggish style interests which you've talked about, right? We're talking about money markets, cosmopolitanism, pluralism, and all the rest of it. And those who are planting the flags, wearing the flags with pride, are saying, no, I've had quite enough of that, really. We have a pre-political loyalty. It's not about bullet points. I'm not saying this is what's going through everyone's heads, but ultimately it's a very raw expression of identity, which is, I'm English, I'm British, I'm very unhappy with the status quo, and that status quo is something that we've just described in some way. But you have talked about lots of political strife, lots of battles, which have also spilled out into physical altercations. It's not just battles of words in Parliament. And so if we were to look at British values and try to come up with some, because often the critics of British values and the notion of them will say, how could you possibly link this period with that period with the period before? If you did that, you would see something different. This is trite and it's nonsense. You're clearly very well read, George. What would British values look like if you could boil them down? If it's not the Blairite and the Brown version, if it's not tolerance, fair play, respect, what would they be?
Well, I mean, of course, if you ask the Tory of, the first decade of the 18th century, Britain had only literally just come into existence, so, English or British or whatever values. As far as they understood what you were talking about, they'd say, well, loyalty to the throne, religion, Christianity, loyalty to the church. Because it's great, during and then 70 or 80 years later, there's all those great prints during the time of the French Revolution, contrasting French principles of republicanism, atheism, immorality, disloyalty with British values of the 1790s of loyalty, content, Protestantism, loyalty to the throne, and so on. So British values clearly had a very different implication in 1790s, or indeed the 1690s. And even then, with it internally, people don't agree on it. No one's ever agreed. Like trying to seek for some sort of consensus is often, shall we say, difficult because different political sides have a different national story. Now, for example, the left has I think one of the problems with the contemporary left is it has a very ambivalent attitude towards the idea of even having a national story, because they're pretty ambivalent about the idea of the nation state in general. But they used to have, a narrative of Britain has our British values are the values of the Levellers and the suffragettes and the Chartists, and here's the national story of protest and of fairness and social justice and so on. Whereas the Tories, obviously, traditionally would have a national story of going back some way, it would be a national story of the stress, loyalty, victory in war, loyalty to the monarch and the church, and so on. So now it seems to be that Blair sort of attempts to have these very generic British values, which I often think, the thing with them is that they're often sort of a distillation of some pretty broad principles of human rights, which could apply anywhere. I mean, I don't really see necessarily how they're particularly British, one way or the other. They could be French values, or or any values of any country in Europe, because they've had to be so generic to cope with various things. Now, one is the fact that what used to be one of the leading principles that everyone would have said, one of the main sort of things that would have underpinned English or British national identity, well, it would have been Christianity. And for large swathes of the time, say the 18th century, it would be Protestant Christianity. What marks you out? What was the contrast between France and Britain? I mean, bearing in mind we were almost constantly at war in one way or another with the French. Well, we're the bastions of Protestant liberty, and the French are Gallic absolutists, and so on. And so, with secularisation, one of the obvious sources of British, what would have been our identity, has gone. And the danger, and sometimes it's that people resurrect it and say, we're a Christian country. Now, I'm a Christian, and I'd like to think we are, but I think, and we are clearly culturally been deeply influenced by Christianity, as my friend Bijan Omrani, who wrote a recent book about this, God is an Englishman. Where clearly, our culture has been massively shaped by Christianity. But the reality is that the number of people in contemporary Britain who practice Christianity in any form, with any devoutness, is a small minority. So you take that away, and you end up appealing to a very generic vision of rights and stuff, which, to be honest, a lot of the time, the supposed British values sound more like the values of the French Revolution than they do anything that could be identified as British, particularly. So I think there's an issue. Now, I don't want to get into too much controversy, but obviously if you have a more pluralistic society and a more multicultural society, it's hard to find distinctive things that everyone can agree to, because religion's gone. Now we're not now we are a religiously pluralistic society. You can't say Britain is a Protestant, we are a Protestant nation anymore, because we obviously have quite significant religious minorities. We always had some religious minorities, but they were tiny numbers. Now, clearly, they're not tiny numbers. They're, more substantial. And also, a lot of people would see themselves as agnostics or atheists or whatever. So that gets no consensus. And then, you can appeal to a shared history, but in an era of polarization, like, people don't agree what the history, I mean, to some extent, they never did. But, I remember when I was growing up in a, left-wing household, which I did, everyone could agree, more or less. The vast majority, Labour votes, Tory votes, could say, look, wherever our differences are, we had the Second World War where we defeated the Nazis. And, Churchill was I grew up basically thinking Churchill was a good thing, even though I was very left-wing background. And I remember in the 90s, you had Mo Mowlam going on the Greatest Britain's programme, if you remember that, where people had to advocate for who they thought the greatest Britain was. And Mo Mowlam went on, Labour cabinet minister at the time, went on and advocated Winston Churchill, because I thought that we could all agree that, like, defeating the Nazis was a good thing. And for all of Churchill's faults, and don't get me wrong, he was a flawed man, but I thought we could all, Labour or Tory, could all sort of see 1940 as the great national unit, where we all came together, the working class and the sort of, middle class and the upper class, we all came together to defeat the Nazis, and that was a great source of national cohesion. Now you see people attacking, it's quite common for people on the sort of more radical progressive left to go on about how Churchill's evil and whatever, and how we don't even have that anymore. So it's like, well, if we can't even agree on Churchill or, an Attlee and so on as, great unifying figures, I don't know, it's really hard to see any unifying British values other than things which are just generic human rights values, which may be, are not necessarily a bad thing, but it's hard to see how they can underpin a cohesive sense of national identity if that's what people want. And it's not clear that everybody does want that, which I personally think is a mistake, because I think I still am an old school social democrat, in many ways. On economic and material issues, I'm not right wing at all. I think it's a good thing to have, strong trade unions and public services and, and so on. That is dependent on having a cohesive sense of national identity, in my opinion. There's a reason why the left did best in this country in, say, the 1940s and 50s, the 40s particularly, when, we had the nation state was the main means of, like, the left winning. and then wasn't seen as particularly contradictory to be a patriotic and believe in the nation state and be on the left. I mean, like, look at Clement Attlee or Ernie Nevin or people like, they were very much patriots, but they were also like in favour, because you need a cohesive sense of national identity to have trust, and trust is the essential basis. If you want to redistribute money, via the welfare state or whatever, you need trust between the people of the country. And I'm sceptical as to whether, if you have very rapid change and you lose a sense of, you become so sort of apologetic about your own national identity, and you think that you have to bend it out of shape to accommodate a sort of unlimited pluralism, then I think you're in trouble, because all of a sudden people look around and they think, well, I'm not sure why should I contribute to the national coffers and the sense of shared solidarity when I don't know who my neighbour is because they've only been here for 5 minutes. I mean, I think the left, the old-fashioned left, which I would still happily identify with if it existed, would do well to like realising that a particular, to some degree, a particularistic sense of national identity is essential for a social democratic policy. Now, that's not to say that we should embrace sort of like racial nationalism, or completely not at all, because I mean, that's very much not our way as a country, I don't think. And it's more a sense of shared cultural, some sense of shared cultural things in common and things that bind us together. Because in my view, the left, as it should be, is about solidarity between fellow human beings. And I'd like to believe that we could have universal brotherhood or sisterhood or whatever based on a sort of airy, sort of vague sense of human rights and universal rights and so on. But all human experience shows that doesn't really work. People to trust each other and to be able to sustain welfare states and public services and stuff like that. You need a bit more than that. You need a bit of shared identity, which is a bit thicker than that. Not as thick as like ethno-nationalism, but thicker than just vague British values. We all believe in fairness. Well, who doesn't believe in fairness? Like, what country in the world is going to say, what I stand for unfairness? No one's going to say that. So it's meaningless, really. Like, you have to have something a bit more distinctive and a bit more like particular than that. Otherwise, you're just a bunch of people, with nothing in common, who are just economic units on an island who have nothing to bind them together. It's like a family. Like, a family you can bring in outsiders. Families can adopt people. That's fine, but they can't adopt like everyone. They have to be. There's a balance to be struck between cohesion and like a sense of solidarity, and not being completely closed to things. And we've never been a completely closed country. We do welcome in strangers, and I'm a Christian, so we should welcome in strangers. But pragmatism and realism suggests that we have to draw a line somewhere, and we have to be realistic about it, and that involves like believing that there are such things as boundaries and nations, and that you can't have completely open borders and stuff. Anyway, that was a long answer to your question.
No, it's all absolutely relevant to the battles that we're having today, and as a brief footnote to that on the social democracy point, is we're seeing decreasing cohesion leading to the breakdown of welfare states, or at least support for them in places that have typically been looked at like the model. So anytime in the US, when someone's trying to do a pro-social democracy platform, they'll go, look at the Scandinavians. But if you go and look at the Scandinavians now, particularly Sweden, who welcomed in something like 15% of its population in the space of 10 years from Middle Eastern, North African, Pakistan, Turkish countries, it's absolutely nosedived the support for the welfare state. The welfare state is almost not wanted anymore because the social trust has been diminished by welcoming lots of people in with different cultural norms. Not suggesting everyone's a bad apple, but the graph do point upwards when it comes to crimes and violent assaults and all the rest of it. You've got the grenades blowing up in the streets and that kind of thing. And if that's people's everyday experience, and all of a sudden they know that's where their tax money's going, they're not really into it. We're seeing it in Switzerland, citizenships being torn up for generations of people that are taking out more than they're putting in. They're going, well, you're clearly not for solidarity. We let you in, you've taken advantage, you're going back. I think that conversation is now entering the fray here in Britain. You're seeing much more of it online, which is now seeping out into the kind of mainstream media and the political discourse. But one final question before you go, George, because I know you are close to wrapping up, and this might be a pithy answer or not, and you can tell me if it's not possible to make it pithy. I don't want to make you late for anything. But the question I ask all of my guests is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life? Perhaps it was something that you thought was an absolute, maybe it was something more day to day. And what was it that made you change your mind and think differently?
Well, I suppose I've changed my mind on two things particularly. One, the most important, is religion, because I was an atheist for a long time, and pretty unthinking atheist, to be honest, and I converted to Christianity about 6 or 7 years ago, and so I now think that the sort of materialistic, humanist, secular assumptions that people take for granted are unsustainable, and without some sense of transcendental morality and I believe in a creator God, it's hard to underpin any sort of the values that we take for granted. And I also believe on independent grounds in the existence of God and the truths of the Christian religion. So that's been a pretty major change. And what made what made me change? I mean, that's a very big question. But I mean, I essentially lost faith in what I saw as an extremely shallow and intellectually unserious form of secular humanist, liberalism, which didn't examine its own foundations and seems to think you can have human rights with no real foundation other than we say so, basically. Whereas I think they are ultimately grounded in God giving, making humans in His own image. So that's quite important, and that this why and I think the danger is, I agree that people, I don't think that unlimited immigration and so on is a good thing. I think we have to have a more pragmatic approach which stresses national cohesion. But I think, that the problem, there's a real danger, which is that the people who take that view, whether they're on the political right. I mean, I don't really see myself as being on the political right as such, but it is often sort of seen in those terms now. If you support the nation state at all, you're seen as being on the political right. But I do think that the danger is, that if we don't cling to some of the Christian teachings or that our civilization were based on, we'll lose sight of the dignity of the individual person, and that will lead to a sort of see this on strands of the right, which are becoming very radical now and resurrecting sort of ethno-nationalist things. And I think that's very dangerous. I think as somebody, was it Ross Dohat said, if you don't like the Christian right, you're not going to like the post-Christian right. And I think that's a very valuable observation. So I think that's the thing that's changed. And the other thing that's changed most, I suppose, in a more political sense, is when I grew up, I was a very unthinking pro-statist. I was various shades as I grew up of left or socialist. Now, I'm the state's inevitable, and I'm not saying I'm against the state, but I've become a bit more sceptical that the way to. I'm also sceptical of the market and capitalism. I don't think that's a perfect answer either. Don't get me wrong, but I suppose I read Polanyi and also, although I by no means endorse his politics really, but I did read Hayek on markets, and I think that those two people, one a sort of Christian socialist, Polanyi, and the other libertarian, those two made me think more about it's not as straightforward as state good, non-state bad. It made markets are also can be dangerous, and private properties should not be worshipped as an idol. But it made me less straightforward and have taken a more nuanced view, shall we say, towards questions of political economy and how we should organise our economic life. Which is to say, I'm not a statist socialist, but neither am I a free market libertarian or liberal. I'm somewhere in between, more communitarian believer in cooperative solutions and non-state forms of solidarity. So anyway, that was a longer answer to your question that you probably banked on, but there are the two things I've changed, I suppose.
Not at all. With regards to your religious conversion, very similar experience that I've had, and we can get into that one day. Politics, also broadly similar, and I can totally understand your political journey there. George, before I let you go, let's plug the book. Where can people find it? When is it coming out? And where can people find you online?
Okay, yes, well, my book is called The Rage of Party, How Whig versus Tory Made Modern Britain. It publishes on the 4th of September. So by the time this comes out, it will already be out. You can get it in good bookshops, but also obviously the usual places, Amazon and so on. And yes, I'm Capelloft on Twitter, or X as it's now called, and you can follow me if you feel inclined to. So yeah, that's my book, The Rage of Party: How Whig versus Tory Made Modern Britain, out on the 4th of September, available all good bookshops.
Great. Well, I recommend everyone buys the book who's listening to it. It really is wonderful. You'd learn an awful lot about the country of Britain if you're not from here. And you just got a bit of a pro-British vibe, you will like it. And also do follow George on Twitter. He's acerbic. He's very, very on the money with political observations, and very rightly has a decent following. George, thanks so much for coming on. It's been really enjoyable to get into the weeds on this and keep fighting the good fight. Looking forward to seeing what comes out next.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your time and for the last half hour. So great.
Thank you. Take care. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.